weekly look at all of the hot topics in HR.
Whether it's passive talent or it's active talent.
That's a soft skill that really gets undersold in the hiring process.
How to manage in the virtual environment.
You get a diverse, cultured group of people. It's a win-win for everybody.
More conversion from candidate leads.
What does that look like in this new virtual world?
Hey everyone, it's Thursday at noon, and you know what that means. It's time for Talent Experience Live. I'm Monica Montessa, one of your co-hosts for today, and I'm one of the leaders of the content marketing team here at Phenom.
And I'm Caitlin Hess. I head up our customer marketing programs at Phenom.
I know we're not the usual faces of Talent Experience Live, but I promise we have a great show on deck for today.
And we are coming at you live from our Ambler PA studio. Thank you to everyone out there joining us. We would love to kick things off with a quick icebreaker. And so as Monica and I were trying to think about what could it be for today, one thing we realized we have a shared passion for is seasonal coffee beverages. And so I am a pumpkin spice latte girl. I don't know, Monica, what's your seasonal beverage of choice? And anyone out there watching, we'd love to hear from you. Drop that in the chat as well.
So I also love pumpkin spice lattes.
Okay.
Always been a PSL girl myself. But I will say a couple years ago, I tried the Starbucks s'mores drink, which is one of their summer specialties. And
awesome.
It's delicious. It's amazing. Totally. Like if you have a sweet tooth, you should definitely try it. I also just tried their sugar cookie flavor today, and that was also delicious.
Okay. I've not tried that one. In the winter, I'm like a peppermint latte, peppermint
refreshing.
coffee. Yeah. So I will definitely have to try that one. But yeah, would love to hear from you guys out there. What is your favorite seasonal coffee beverage? And while you're sharing that, make sure that you think about sharing this on your LinkedIn. Share it with your network. We stream this live every Thursday at noon Eastern time on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And if you're not able to join us for the full episode today, we'll post a recap of today's episode, phenom.com/blog. You can also rewatch the recording on LinkedIn after the episode. But we've got a great show today. So Monica, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So today we're going to be talking about hidden biases in recruiting. And we all know what an important topic this is, not just for recruiters, but for organizations in general and employees.
Awesome. Yeah. And we've got a great guest lined up. Super excited to welcome Tom Lakin. He's the Director of Innovation at Resource Solutions. And what's super interesting about Tom and the perspective that he brings is he and the team at Resource Solutions work with hundreds of organizations across the world on their diverse hiring initiatives. So welcome, Tom. All right. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us. First things first, today's icebreaker was all around our favorite seasonal coffee beverages. Would love to hear what's yours.
Yeah, you both totally put me to shame with your exotic drinks. And I was kind of thinking, what do I love drinking in summer? What do I love drinking in winter? It's basically the same year round. Just give me a black coffee, no milk, no sugar, wakes me up.
All right. I love that.
Yeah, can't go wrong with that for sure.
To kick us off, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about Resource Solutions and your role there.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a global recruitment business. So we've got a few parts to our business though. We've got the recruitment outsourcing part of the business, and then we've got the workforce advisory. So we really help HR teams with all things recruitment. So some companies basically outsource literally everything, so the end-to-end recruitment process to us. And then others just give us kind of some staff augmentation when they need a little bit of a helping hand. I lead our advisory practice. So my role is really to be helping HR leaders with solutions relating to every single bit of HR, basically from diverse hiring through to quality of hire. Attrition, key topic at the moment as well. So we're doing a lot of work in that space.
Awesome. Great. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Tom. It's always great to have other guests on the show and different perspectives and, just getting right into today's topic. Caitlin and I were talking about just what has transpired over the last year and how incredible it is to reflect on how our global society has really been impacted as a whole. And I think what's interesting is, with all of the different social justice movements, they've had such a significant impact and have really deeply shifted the mindsets of individuals, of corporations, and at that level. So from your perspective, how have issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion really influenced employers and the workplace over the last year?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the pace of change in the past, certainly 18 months, has been at a totally different pace than we've ever seen before. I'd really say it's a proper seismic shift in overall attitudes. And I think most of us kind of can probably see that. But some of the movements that have had most impact, things like BLM, have really made us hold a mirror up, I think, to ourselves personally. I'm not sure whether you both feel like this as well, but certainly when we were watching the events transpire, it was a case of what am I doing as an individual? Am I doing my bit? Am I behaving and living my life in the way that I should be? So there was a kind of internal reflection piece. Now that's significant from a workforce perspective, because obviously all of us as individuals make up a workforce. So there's that internal individual reflection piece, but then there's the corporate piece. And certainly we had that as well at Resource Solutions, which was a case of, we've always felt that we were pretty pioneering. We were kind of doing some good stuff. We were doing things like projects to make jobs accessible to people who don't speak English at home, to make job adverts accessible and gender neutral, for example. So and we were doing that years and years ago. But when we kind of reflected, were we doing enough? I think the answer was probably no. And that was really, I think, for me, the killing of George Floyd about 18 months ago was the instigator for that, which was actually, are we doing enough? And certainly it wasn't just enough to reflect on it. You obviously have to change your behavior as well. And one of the things that we did was actually think, okay, we need to be able to actually identify hidden bias, which is obviously the topic of today, but it's such a key topic because we don't know what we don't know. And that was really the output following the killing of George Floyd, was how we tackled it. Was we need to have an academic framework to identify that bias.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I love the perspective of, individually you're reflecting on, am I doing enough as a person? And I think, we've seen a shift organizationally, and obviously it's been a huge focus. But I love that focus on, like, am I doing enough, because we're individuals and we make up that organization. But, to kind of dig into that a little bit more, we know that meaningful change doesn't happen overnight. What are some of the challenges employers are facing as they're sort of implementing these D&I initiatives?
I think the first one is that people love talking about change, but fewer people actually love genuinely changing and doing things differently. And I think that probably is a line that you could probably use on almost any of your interview panels, because whether it's trialing new technology or whatever, everyone is, who wants to do that change? Not so many. So I think that's one of the big blockers, is that people are kind of, they don't necessarily want to do things differently. I think secondly, recruitment has the challenge in the fact that we largely recruit in a pretty standard way. It hasn't changed that much, arguably, for decades. Yes, there's been new innovations like LinkedIn and, of course, Phenom. But in reality, people are largely recruiting in the same way. So we're changing something that is quite embedded. And then thirdly, and I think this is probably the main reason, is the fact that people just don't know what their biases are. We don't know that when we ask someone to do 7 stages of interviews, we don't actually often know that in itself disadvantages female candidates, because female candidates typically have less free time than men. So that's just one example of a hidden bias, which means that it becomes very difficult for organizations to minimize bias if they simply have no idea what it is. So I think that's the main blocker, as long as those, as well as those some kind of broader kind of change constructs that I mentioned.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we were talking about that, you know, you and I, Tom, were talking last week about this, and that was something that stuck with me. Like, one of the biggest issues is that people often don't know that they're being biased because they don't have that perspective or their experience is different. And so, you know, you mentioned the example of 7 rounds of interviews. What are some of those other sort of hidden biases that are happening in HR that we might not be thinking of or we might not know?
Yeah, I mean, there's really kind of, I mean, if you really every single stage in a recruitment process has the potential to introduce bias, and often they do. And so I mean, there's a few things that are very common. I mean, actually in the US, asking people's salary, for example, is well, it's illegal in many states, but globally, it's actually often totally standard practice to just, if I was interviewing, say, you know, well, Kaden, what's your current salary? You know, I'm going to base my offer to you on on your current salary. Now, as I said, obviously that's less of a challenge in many US locations, but globally, that's something that we need to tackle, because the gender pay gap isn't actually getting any better, and it's pretty horrendous in many markets anyway, and particularly in finance and tech. So by avoiding those kind of questions, which, and all the research shows that actually asking someone's current salary disadvantages women, and Black women in particular. These are the kind of questions that nobody often really means for that to be, that people don't often ask that question thinking, I'm going to pay someone less because they are a Black female. They often just think of it, well, they didn't realize that, and then they just base their offer on their current. So it's not intentional. It's what I call innocent ignorance, as in they're not meaning to. It's often well-intentioned or thoughtless, but it is ignorant. And there's a number of other examples that you can go through like that as well, like tech platforms. You know, I was really pleased to see when I was taking part in this that your viewers can access this talk now on any device. So if you've got Android, if you've got Apple, you can view us all now, and this is in this content. Well, a lot of employer branding content is only available on apps that are Apple only. Well, Black candidates are more likely to use an Android device than white candidates are. So it's not intentional bias. It's very hidden, but it's still biased nonetheless, and it actively disadvantages certain candidates. So these are the kind of things that we need to start bringing to clients and making people aware that this hidden bias and someone's innocent ignorance isn't okay. You know, there are ways around it. We can fix these problems. We don't also want to judge people for them. It's about bringing people on the journey.
Right. That's such a great point, Tom. You know, I think a lot of what you said too, you know, just that level of awareness, and even just being open to asking those questions, you know, just thinking more critically about the interview questions that you're asking, and, you know, the different environments in which you're connecting with candidates, and starting to question, you know, all of these different things. Are there other perspectives that I should be considering when it comes to, you know, how I perceive different individuals, and what are those different biases that can be influenced there? So when you talk about some of these different hidden biases and bringing awareness to those things, what would you recommend recruiters do in order to get started with uncovering more of these biases for their specific interview processes?
Yeah, I think it needs to go firstly beyond the interview process. It's not just enough to think, okay, let's look at just our interview questions. You need to have, it needs to be an end-to-end audit essentially. And that's really what we do at Resource Solutions for our clients, is we audit an end-to-end recruitment process. So from the moment that someone types into Google, you know, a company and careers, how do I find it? That the content they're served could potentially perpetuate bias. The way that you apply could potentially perpetuate bias. The facial representation. If you look at careers content, for example, white men are massively overrepresented We did an audit in New York, and New York is for a client, and New York is it's about 50% white, kind of by and large, looking at the data, 25% black, 25% Latinx. If you looked at hiring companies in New York, there's no representation of that mix. The faces that you see don't reflect that community, for example. So you need to break it down into all of those different stages, all the way through to referral process, through to onboarding even. So you need to conduct that audit and then apply validated research to it, because the risk here is that you can be really well intentioned, but actually you have bias ourselves. Right. So you need to anchor it in academic research, and that's certainly something I'm a big advocate of. So if you don't have those skills yourself, then you as a hiring manager or as a recruiter need to work with a partner that does have that knowledge. That's the very first step. Hold a mirror up to what the current process is. Don't make any changes until you know what you need to fix.
Such a great point. I love that, just taking a deeper look at what you're doing and, how can you start to implement, more meaningful change.
Exactly.
So, and you mentioned too, Tom, that's part of what your company is there to do and provide for organizations. Can you share a little bit about what else you're doing specifically to support companies in their D&I initiatives?
Wow, yeah. I mean, there's really a whole plethora of things that you can do. I think we usually recommend the starting point is an audit. And that's typically the gateway when people are either just starting in their journey, in that diverse hiring journey, or once they've actually just re-engineered their process and they want to confidence check it. Those are the two times that people come to us and say, do you know what? We need to have an impartial audit from people who really know this and who link it in with that. So that audit piece is usually the first piece. And that's broken up into two stages where we audit an end-to-end process, which takes about 4 or 5 weeks. We hold the mirror up looking through 8 lenses. And again, this is the key thing that I would suggest people do is people can be quite blinkered and think diversity means gender, diversity means ethnicity. Have a think about all of the diversity dimensions that you want. It's appropriate for you to cover in your audit based on the demographics that you work in. So typically we would recommend looking at gender, ethnicity, disability and neurodiversity, LGBTQ+, age, faith, socioeconomic, and veteran status. Those are kind of the 8 diversity dimensions that largely I work to when I work with clients. And so that's the process, and then you apply that to the end-to-end recruitment process. So first of all, you hold the mirror up, and then you have the recommendations. And that's the key bit, I think, is the to-do list. I think so often these, webinars, I'm sure all of us have been on, many of the viewers now have been on webinars where like, oh my God, that was fascinating. And then your behavior doesn't change at all afterwards. And that's kind of what we need to get away from, which is if we're going to invest in time in an audit, make sure it's doing things differently. And that's what we do, which is these are the typically about 70 recommendations these are the 70 process recommendations we suggest you make. That might be from a branding perspective. It might be the fact that some of the technology has biases. You might need to look at things from an ethics perspective. So that's kind of the first piece is the audit. And then other solutions are often a bit more tailored. Some of them are data-led. So one thing that I'm utterly obsessed with and would totally recommend anyone does is have a look at your own internal data and have a look at your representation, and then work with a partner like us or another specialist to bring external data so for example, from a gender perspective. You might say, well, we're 40% female in our legal department. Is that good or bad? You would ideally expect 50%, of course, gender parity. But really what's helpful is to actually look at the external data and be like, do you know what? Actually, the market supply in that area is 33%. So whilst it's not parity, it's actually probably not an area of focus initially. Whereas in your fintech team, you might be 7% female, and yet the market might be 30, in which case you're massively underrepresenting even the talent supply in that case. So that's another big piece, is the data piece. I mean, you've got to be careful here. I could talk for hours about this, and literally you're going to be going and having one of your pumpkin lattes just to wake yourself up. But yeah, we do a number of other projects. Another one of my favorite ones is neurodiverse hiring events, which is so many processes almost feel like they're almost designed almost to disadvantage neurodiverse talent. They're not intentionally designed to, but almost everything part of it actively disadvantages candidates. So many things that certainly pre-pandemic, it's natural to just reach out your hand and say welcome. Well, many neurodiverse candidates might feel less comfortable with that, and certainly many large organizations have TV screens with blaring, throughout, loads of corporate messaging going on. Many of our clients, even in the lifts, you've got plasma screens in the lifts. That can be distracting for most of us as humans, but we're naturally distracted by them. That's the point of them. But neurodiverse candidates can actually be disadvantaged by those kind of processes. So one of the things that we love doing is redesigning, re-engineering processes, and just stripping out the things that cause bias or disadvantage certain candidates.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think those are some really great sort of tangible examples of things that I know I had not necessarily considered or thought about. And you talked a little bit about this in terms of accessibility and where technology is present. But have you seen any technology that helps with this process or makes it a little bit easier for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few tools that I would just say, I'd recommend familiarizing yourself with, like Google Lighthouse, which is one of the accessibility tools and just has a look at your website accessibility. It's one of those relatively simple from a user perspective anyway, to just flag some of the immediate barriers. So that's certainly one that I would have in your toolkit. There's some well-established tools. You've probably heard of Textio and some of the other kind of language analyzer tools. I'm a really big fan of them because I think that anything that makes things quite easy. So for those of you who are watching who don't know Textio, it's a Seattle-based organization that looks at gender bias, for example, and readability of job adverts. And it's automated. And I think that when these are the tools that are helpful, where you can you copy and paste a job description and or a job ad, and it flags the potential biases. So I'm a big fan of that. LinkedIn has some brilliant features that I just think are totally underused. I was doing a training session for our recruiters recently about how to look within LinkedIn Recruiter and look at the response rates from female candidates versus male candidates. And what's fascinating is that in almost all cases, our male recruiters have high response rates from male candidates, and our female recruiters either have parity or higher response from female candidates. And that's the kind of thing that just wakes us up. These are the tools. This is where tech is good. There's so many critiques at the moment about, so many questions from an ethics perspective. But when tech is done right, it's great. And obviously in Phenom, there's a number of features that, again, certainly we would very much advocate to our clients looking at. Things like cultivating communities and things is so much easier to do in a really sophisticated platform like Phenom. And so yeah, we totally suggest having a look at all of those. One thing I would say is that there isn't a single silver bullet. So anyone on this call hoping to just literally think, I'm going to buy one tech after this and I don't even ever to do anything else, I'm sorry to break it to you, but it's going to be a little bit longer than that.
Sure. Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? The Staples Easy button, right? And yeah, I think that's super interesting that it's sort of that combination of all of the technologies that comes on sort of executing on those initiatives that start from the top. But I've seen some really interesting things from our customers as well. You mentioned some of those groups. So we've got a feature called employee resource groups where you can, create these separate communities for specific groups that you want to engage with. And, also just getting your open recs posted in places where people you might want to be targeting for these initiatives are looking. So we've got XML feeds that are tied to specific diversity focused job boards. Also can set up diversity focused networking events. So lots of different options, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think to add on to that too, there's so much technology and software that people might already be using. And it's a matter of how are you using those different tools or communication channels to communicate your message and show a greater representation, a more diverse representation. And you had mentioned, what are you doing to communicate, more diversity on your career site? How are you engaging and communicating through email and leveraging social media? And I think there are, some of those tools that people can start using right away even.
Absolutely. I think the one word of warning that I'd have with those is that it's not enough just to be well-intentioned. These tools are here. They're an enabler. They're an inclusion enabler, but that's the point I made before. They're not the sole solution. So you do need to be careful not to be exclusionary. And I think that on some of these outbound campaigns, and when we host a number of focus groups to understand about actually, well, how do you feel as an underrepresented individual in this organization? How do you feel about messaging? And so we actually need to understand some of the emotional triggers. So I think if you are looking at having targeted campaigns, make sure that no one is ever excluded from that message. So it may be particularly relevant to certain candidates. So you may have, for example, have an LGBTQ plus campaign that is more likely to resonate with those candidates, for example. But it should never be a situation where you've got an individual, so in that scenario, a straight candidate that doesn't feel as though they are welcome to participate. And that's easier to talk about on a conversation like this than it is to do in practice. And I think this is, again, where you need to have brilliant tech and brilliant thought leaders who really know about it. And then when they combine, that's when the magic starts happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So from your experience and different companies that you've worked with, of course, you don't have to call out any specific ones, but are there any examples that you'd like to share with our viewers about real ways that they're, approaching more diversity in initiatives and making it more, showing more actionable takeaways than just talking the talk?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I won't give specific names, and maybe I'll just kind of go on kind of some of the initiatives that really action meaningful change, the things that they do that I love. Some organizations are really, I think, nailing upskilling, and that to me is it's a topic that spans, or a kind of an intervention that spans so many topics. It's not just diversity and inclusion. It's also about filling the skills gap. It's about social mobility. It's about future planning and succession planning. So it's such a hot topic, but some organizations do that really, really well, using platforms and technology to make sure that they're upskilling their current workforce. So I'd have that as one pillar of success. If you're looking for kind of best in class examples, look to organizations that are focusing on upskilling as well. There's also some organizations that have some fairly in some ways very standard processes, but that they just tweak. And it can be small changes that have a massive impact. So there's a publishing house, a global publishing house, that actually bans referrals up to a certain level. So they've got a employee referral program like most companies do for managerial positions where you need a specific skill set. But they've banned grad or early careers level referrals because they just found that it was actively blocking their diversity and inclusion initiatives. Now that's a small change. There's no real tech change there, but they did it really, really well. And then also removing academic requirements and things like that as well. It's just where people are literally just challenging hiring managers. The companies that I really respect and I love is where the recruitment teams are empowered and informed enough to really push back at the hiring managers and say, do you know what? You don't necessarily need an Ivy League academia background here. Actually, have you opened it up to these? And this company's doing that really well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, we talked a little bit about this, or you talked a little bit about, being well-intentioned is not enough, and understanding that, if you're sending a campaign in an effort to be inclusive, to make sure that you're not accidentally excluding a different group. And so would love to dig into that a little bit more. Have you seen any other things that maybe were well-intentioned, but didn't work out, things that our audience should be aware of or pay attention to?
Yeah, there are definitely initiatives, kind of in the same way with everything. There's always in any organization, there's things that fail, and diverse hiring is no different to that. So I don't think that we need to be anxious about failing. We need to be anxious, and we need to be mindful that we don't cause offense, and that thought and different cultural perspectives are taken into account. But if something doesn't simply work, I think we can be fairly relaxed about that. We learn from it and move on. I'm going to give you one example that is really interesting, because we did it a few years ago, which was an anonymized sourcing. So people often call it blind sourcing, but I prefer the phrase anonymized sourcing, or anonymized CVs and resumes. And I was really excited about doing it. Obviously, it's quite a hot topic, and it makes a lot of sense. The fact that if you can't see someone's name, you can't see their age, you can't see their gender, you hire them on merit. It sounds amazing. And so many clients loved the idea of this, but we did a controlled study. So when in my team, we have to critically analyze. We can't just kind of run with something. We have to check whether it works. Obviously, we go through that huge amounts of due diligence. And one of those was, let's see whether this works. Let's see whether anonymized sourcing works. And what we found out was it had exactly the opposite effect of what I'd expected. Which caused me quite a few headaches, actually, because I've been planning on rolling it out and it being a massive success, and I had to kind of put the brakes on pretty quickly, because the findings were that actually the all candidates were disadvantaged by anonymized CVs. So for every gender, every ethnicity, every age group, all were less likely to be progressed in a recruitment process through the anonymized process. So that's an example of something that I'm not saying don't do it. There are scenarios where I've seen it work, but just be mindful that when we did our controlled studies at Resource Solutions, we did have that opposite effect, as did, interestingly, the Australian government. So with all of these kind of projects, go in with an open mind, and do some research as well. And if you haven't got capacity, again, reach out to a partner who can do that for you and advise on the pros and the cons, and then you can make informed decisions. And as I said before, some of the campaigns pieces, where they've just been so targeted on specific groups, I've seen have disproportionately negative receptions from people outside of those groups. And we've got to remember that really, for this to work, everyone needs to be coming on this journey. It needs to be a case of allies as well. So thought needs to go into those, and I think there's some kind of fairly common examples that we've seen there that received media coverage as well, where they haven't worked.
Yeah, I think that's a great, those are great examples of, what to be aware of as we're starting some of these different initiatives and trying things out for the first time. Yeah. And, just taking that moment to reflect on how things are performing, what is the feedback, how are people responding, and like you mentioned, doing the research. So, those are some of the challenges that we should be aware of. When it comes to DE&I, we know there's not going to be a moment where everything's just perfect for our companies and for employees. It's a journey. It's always going to be evolving and something that's living and breathing. But, from your perspective, is there any measurement or goal or milestone, like key milestone, that companies should strive to get to when it comes to DE&I?
So I'm kind of, as I said, I love using data. So basically, any goals should be data led. But I think there are some things that, even if people don't want to have specific hiring goals or targets, and a lot of companies do feel slightly uncomfortable about that, I personally do like having those targets. But I'd be kind of exercise caution with some of those. But I think getting people involved, getting the right people together is absolutely key. So having the diverse hiring specialists working really, really closely with the inclusion practitioners, you need those two people to make these things work.
That's awesome. And to kind of wrap things up here, I love what you said at the very beginning. And I think that's so important too. It's am I as an individual doing enough? And ultimately understanding the impact we each have on our organization and all of these initiatives, I think is so important. And I love the idea of using data, but if we get to a certain thing, check mark, that's done, let's put it away, I think is probably not the way we want to handle all of this. So I think that's important too. Before we let you go, any final thoughts, Tom, to share with the audience?
I think just step back for a second and pause. And I think that's the first thing that I would just say is that many of us are so passionate about this, and that's what's amazing. That's why it's great to see so many people joining today. It's so because we care about it, and that's brilliant. But what we need to make sure is that we're re-engineering and auditing in the right way, and we're doing things in the right way. So just step back, understand what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to manage inclusion or diverse hiring? And I would personally suggest separating the two, having them very closely together and having them interlinked and making sure that the knowledge is shared, but they're slightly different problems. And I think that's my key thing is recommending having a look at your diverse hiring channels. That's what we specialize in. And obviously there's a lot of other organizations or internal teams that focus on the inclusion piece, but understand what you're trying to analyze, and then have a very, very consistent methodology really, and make sure it's data led. So again, make sure that you're not, again, those good intentions, putting in just a little bit more bias when you're actually trying to minimize it. So yeah, go with a steady auditing process, keep that data focus, as well as obviously a bit of the emotion and the passion that makes this all come to life as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Tom, for joining us. This was super informative, really helpful. Loved the perspective, and thanks again to our entire audience for tuning in.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. To wrap things up, Monica, I know we've got a lot of great stuff coming up from a Phenom perspective. Do you want to share more?
Sure, happy to. So we have an exciting, amazing event coming up called Phenom AI Day that will be held this December 9th. So we're actually going to be hosting a live broadcast streaming from our global Phenom campuses around the world. And we'll have field experts who will be demonstrating just exactly how HR professionals are using systems of intelligence to hire, develop, and retain talent. And we all know just how truly difficult it is to do all of those things. It's where people are struggling to find candidates to hire. It's so competitive right now, and employees are leaving at an alarming rate. And I think what will be amazing at this event is, we'll be talking about all of the different ways that technology, and specifically AI, can really help companies overcome a lot of these challenges. So be sure to save your seat. Registration and seats will be limited. You can go to ai.phenom.com to save your spot right now.
Awesome. Yeah, super excited for that. And, before we wrap up here, don't forget to subscribe. LinkedIn, YouTube. You can stay up to date on all things HR, our blog as well, phenom.com/blog. Lots of great content from Monica's team and other experts in the industry. So make sure you subscribe.
We'll catch you next week, same time, same place, and a special co-host reappearance. See you guys.
Bye.